On December 12, 2004, at age 81, a retired Michigan shipping supervisor died. He had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. 6 decades before, this man did something no one else did during World War II. He was the only person who fought in the US Army and the Soviet Red Army after escaping a German prison camp. Something out of a movie, you would say. Maybe, but this story really happened. And the main character, his name was Joseph Beyrle. But who was Joseph Beyrle? And why was what he did so incredible? Well, you will find out in this video. Joe's parents were German immigrants. They came to America in the late 1800s and settled, like many Northern Europeans, in the upper Midwest of the United States. In this case, the state of Michigan. Joe was born on August 25, 1923. Like many men and women of what's come to be called the Greatest Generation, Joe and his family were struck by the Great Depression. The family stood in food lines, and Joe's 2 older brothers dropped out of high school to join the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, one of the many government programs started under Roosevelt to help pull the USA out of the Depression. They did this to send money back to their parents and younger siblings, Joe and his younger sister, who passed away from scarlet fever at 16. Joe was a senior in high school when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. 6 months later, Joe was inducted into the US Army as a volunteer at Fort Custer, Michigan. Joe could have stayed home, at least for a while, for he had received a full scholarship to a great university, Notre Dame. But like so many young men in those years, Joe got on a bus and headed to the Army Induction Center. On the second day at Custer, Joe's training unit was given a talk by an officer who told them that the Army was training a new kind of unit, the Paratroopers, and needed volunteers. These men would be paid an extra $50 a month from training onward and would be sure to see a lot of action. He likely added that the paratroops only wanted men who thought they could handle the toughest training in the Army. Joe and 10 other men volunteered. They boarded a train in Battle Creek, Michigan, and soon found out they were headed to Camp Toccoa in Georgia. Now maybe some of you are figuring out what unit Joe joined, the soon-to-be famous 101st Airborne. He was also assigned to the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment commanded by Colonel Robert Sink. For those of you who have watched the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, Joe was assigned to Company I, not the famous E, Easy Company, of the book and series. For those of you who watched the series, you know that Toccoa was no joke. The men were pushed to their physical and mental limits almost every day. Later in life, Joe related the training regimen. Seemingly endless push-ups, forced marches of 30 miles or more with full gear in the late Georgia summer, a long obstacle course practically every day, 30 minutes of non-stop calisthenics followed by 1 to 4 mile runs every day. This on top of their specific training as a soldier, and in Joe's case, as a radio man. Infamous Mount Toccoa was 1.5 miles up and 1.5 miles down, 3 to 5 times a week. Joe's battalion was the 3rd, the same as the men in E Company, and he also took part in the record-setting 72-hour forced march to Atlanta mentioned in Band of Brothers. Outside Atlanta, Joe had his parachute training and received his jump wings from the hands of Colonel Sink himself. He went home on leave, and when he returned to duty, he was sent for even further specialized and individualized training as a radio man, but also in demolitions. Joe was being trained for something special, but at the time, he had no idea what it would be. He joined the rest of the 506 in North Carolina, and in spring and early summer 1943, made more jumps and took part in war games in Tennessee. More training followed in July and August. Then the 101st was sent to New York, where they boarded a troop ship headed for England, arriving in September 1943. Between September and January, Joe trained with Company I, but was then selected to receive additional training with the British. As a result, Beyrle was one of the few men to earn American and British jump wings during the war. Joe then volunteered for special duty. Joe and 2 other men were to go on a unique mission. Joe never found out the names of the other men nor what unit they were in. They were likely told not to ask. Joe's first mission was to parachute behind German lines into France. Joe wasn't told exactly where he would drop, but he plunged into the night over France strapped with 2 heavy bandoliers of gold coins destined for the French resistance. Joe and the 2 other men had no idea where they were, but they were met by members of the resistance on schedule, and they were taken to a safe house. The main part of Joe's mission was over in a moment, but the hardest part was to come. For the next week or so, Joe was on the move, along with various resistance members who escorted him to a remote runway where the British picked him up and returned him to England. He repeated the mission a month later. The whole time, Joe must have been on high alert to ambush, betrayal, and mistakes. On June 6, 1944, Joe dropped behind the beaches of Normandy with the rest of the 101st. Beyrle's plane was one of the many to be hit by German anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft flew lower than the minimum jump altitude to avoid this, but could not do that before the jump zone appeared. Joe and the men in his stick jumped from 400 feet. Like another famous paratrooper during the battle, Joe found himself landing and stuck on a church roof while fighting went on below him. Finally getting loose, he slid off the roof and headed towards the 2 bridges his unit was assigned to blow up. Today there is a plaque outside the church at Saint-Côme-du-Mont where Joe began his fight against the Nazis. Joe's time in frontline combat with the 101 was short. He walked through the night towards his unit's target, and on the way, threw grenades at Germans passing by in the night. But as he was trying to hide, he crawled over a small berm and into a German machine gun position. He was taken prisoner, and this began a long and arduous odyssey. He was shelled and bombed by friendly fire and planes, escaped, and was caught again. Joe was beaten senseless for calling a German officer an SOB, and was eventually shipped to a prison camp in Germany. Joe and a few others escaped from this camp and hopped a train they thought was moving towards Poland, but was heading towards Berlin. Joe's group stopped at a train marshalling yard in Berlin, and he and the others were fortunate enough to run into a sympathetic train worker who helped them find shelter on the city's outskirts. They were hidden by friendly Germans but eventually were found by the Gestapo. Joe was tortured. Joe's German name caught their attention and he was accused of being a spy. Luckily, word had gotten out and a German army officer showed up demanding the army prisoners back. Joe was taken to Stalag Luft 3, where his treatment for having escaped was not much better than being in the hands of the Gestapo. Solitary confinement in a tiny cell for a week, bread and water. When he was released, Joe and a few others devised another escape plan involving a farmer's cart and barrels to hide it. This was January 1945. Having a secret radio in camp, the men knew the Soviets were about 50 miles away. Joe was shot at and chased by dogs but managed to escape. He traveled at night, stole food where he could from farms, and on the 3rd day of his adventure, he heard the sounds of battle around the hayloft he was in. Through the slats, Joe watched as Russian unit parked tanks and armored cars in the farmyard. Joe climbed down, raised his arms, and called "Amerikansky Tovarish," American comrade. The unit commander was the only female tank commander of the famed Soviet First Guards Army, Alexandra Samyusenko, who had been awarded for bravery at the pivotal Battle of Kursk in 1943. Her tank was an American Sherman, given to the Soviets under Lend-Lease. Joe took part in several firefights with the Soviets, including the liberation of his own POW camp, which took many POWs by surprise, to say the least. Sadly, Captain Samyusenko was killed in action, and Joe was later wounded in the leg and found himself in a Soviet Army hospital. The word had gotten about that a US soldier was fighting with the Red Army. Joe got a visit from the biggest Soviet hero of World War II, Marshal Zhukov, who listened intently to his story. Eventually, Joe was evacuated and ended up in Moscow, where he was in touch with the US Embassy. There he found out that the US Army had notified his parents that he had been killed in Normandy. Joe's trip back home took him to Odessa, Turkey, Egypt, Italy, and England. Finally, in 1946, he married his boyhood sweetheart in the same church where his funeral had been held in the summer of 1944. Joe was awarded the following medals and citations after the war: Purple Heart, French Croix de Guerre, the Soviet Order of the Red Banner, and Medal for the Liberation of Warsaw, and the US World War II Victory Medal. We hope you enjoyed our video. Please leave a comment down below about your thoughts and don't forget to like it. Subscribe to the channel as an offering to the gods of the algorithm and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.